everyone, Pastor Donna here from Heaven to Earth Ministries, and today is our third segment on the book of Esther. And just to give you a little bit of a refresh from last week and what we discussed, after he returned home from his defeat by the Greeks, King Xerxes realized that he no longer had a queen. And because he no longer had a queen, there was no one to comfort him. And it's likely that that kind of put him into a little bit of a depression, which we can understand. You know, part of a good marriage partnership is being able to talk to your partner, you know, when you're feeling down or defeated. And so, of course, he didn't have a queen to do that with. And so his advisors, you know, they knew of his lustful nature. So they made this recommendation that he bring in all the best virgins of the land, and he would enjoy the most of these virgins. And then the one that he enjoyed the most would replace Queen Vashti and become the queen. So as circumstances continued and everything was happening, the Jewish girl Esther ended up being the one that he cherished the most, and she became his queen. Then her cousin Mordecai, who was the one who raised her, he overheard a plot to assassinate King Xerxes, and he was able to get that message over to Esther, and Esther in turn informed the king so that this plot to assassinate him was stopped, and of course those who were instigating it were put to death. So this takes us into chapter 3. If we were to give a theme to Esther chapter 3, that theme would be not compromising. Okay? Not to compromise. And we'll start reading first about a courageous stand in verses 1 through 3 of Esther chapter 3. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Why did Mordecai refuse to kneel or pay honor to this man Haman? We might think it was because honor only belonged to God, but history shows that Mordecai did bow down or pay honor to others. So there was another reason behind that, and most likely it's because, as in verse 1, it mentioned that Haman was an Agagite, and the Agagite were enemies of Israel. And King Saul, as a matter of fact, was ordered to destroy and kill every Agagite alive. But unfortunately, he disobeyed and saved the king, and Haman was likely an ancestor of this king. But the main point to remember here is that the Agagites were enemies of the Jews. They hated the Jews, and the Jews likewise hated them. And there's a long history behind that as to why the hatred was. But they did plunder the Jews when they were in the wilderness and kind of took advantage of them. So they were hated. So as we go on here to chapter 2, we're going to find out that Haman reacted with very evil intent to the fact that Mordecai would not bow down to him. So we're going to read verses 4 through 6, and we'll learn about that. Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Now, it's possible, as a matter of fact, highly likely, that Haman had not realized that Mordecai was a Jew until he was told. In verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. And this implies that, a very, very deep anger, almost poisonous type of rage. So it's possible that before this time, there really was no enmity between Haman and Mordecai, especially since Haman was not aware that Mordecai was a Jew. But in verse 6, yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, okay, so in other words, he's learning that he's a Jew, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So we can see that evil reaction there of Haman, that he wanted to get rid of them all. He saw this as an opportunity to get rid of the Jews who were enemies of the Agagites. And so he basically, in a way, it almost looks as if he's kind of like Satan, who wants to destroy God's people, because in that day, the Jews were God's people. Now, as we go on, we're going to read a little bit more about this plot in verses 7 through 9. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pur, that is, the lot, in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. So we can really see the evidence here of the hatred that he had. First of all, they were casting lots. They're in verse 7. And the casting of lots was in April 484 BC, which would have meant the days for the Jews' destruction would be March 7th, 483 BC. So that was about 1 year away. That, so Haman would have to wait that whole year. And also of note is, let's see, what stood out to me in verse 8. Haman never mentioned who the people are, whom he thought worthy for the king to destroy. So he never mentioned he was talking about the Jews. Is that significant? I'm not sure, but it's interesting to me that he didn't tell him who those people were. He just said, there's these people who, totally disobey you. And the phrase, their laws are different, okay, which is part of that. Their laws are different from those of all other people, was implied that this was something they were repeatedly doing, that they were constantly going against the king's laws. So it kind of put them, you can see how this would enrage the king, that here were these people living in his empire that absolutely refused to obey any of his laws. So Haman kind of, he really stretched what he was saying here. Also of significance is the amount of silver. So that is in verse, let's see where it was, verse 9, where it talked about 10,000 talents of silver. To us, that's kind of just a number. Okay, he offered him 10,000 talents of silver. But this was not a small chunk of change, like a few quarters or something that we throw on. 10,000 talents of silver is quite a bit. It's considered that the total annual income of the Persian Empire was 15,000 talents of silver. So 10,000 talents of silver, that'd be about 375 tons. And if we were to put that at a value today, with silver being about $8 an ounce, that amounts to $96 million. So that wasn't chunk change. That was a pretty good amount of silver that Haman was offering to pay to the king. Now, Charles Swindoll, he pointed out that, and I think it's pretty obvious here, that Haman knew which buttons to push here with the king, because first of all, he appealed to the king's superstitions. Second, he appealed to the king's conceit and self-importance, or what he thought of himself, way too much, and his greed. So Haman appealed to all of these things to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish. Okay, so let's go on now and read some more. We're going to start with verse 10 and read through 12. We'll discuss that a little bit. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to all the king's satraps, governors, the various provinces, and the nobles of various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his ring. So, in essence, it's almost like giving Haman a platinum card and saying, do what you want, And, of course, Haman did. He did what he wanted with it. And he became the ultimate oppressor of the Jews. Interestingly, just as Haman had to get the king's permission to attack the Jews, our enemy, our ultimate enemy, can't do anything to us beyond what God allows him to. And that's encouraging to know. We might remember the story of Job and how Satan had to get God's permission before he could cause harm to come to Job and his family. And by extension, that applies to us as well. Satan can't just attack us. He has to ask for permission first. So I can read you a scripture related to that. It's in 1 Corinthians. Then we'll get back to Esther once we read that in 1 Corinthians. And that is chapter 10 and verse 13. And that reads, no temptation has seized you except what is common to men. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. And this is an encouraging thought, because if we're going through something, God is allowing it because he knows that we can handle it, or that he's going to provide us with what we need to handle it. And to me, that's encouraging, because I know that I'm pretty safe in God's hands. So let's go ahead and go on to the reactions of the people when they heard this decree that all the Jews were to be killed on this particular day. And that is in chapter 3 of Esther, verses 13 through 15. I can get my tablet to cooperate with me here. Verses 13 through 15. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. So Haman wasn't happy enough to just kill every single one of them, including children and elderly and all of that, but he also said they could plunder all their goods. Verse 14, a copy of the text of this edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to people of every nationality so they'd be ready for that day. Spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. Okay, so destroy, kill, annihilate. It indicated the totality that Haman wanted for the Jewish people. And of course, if that had happened, okay, that would have fulfilled Satan's goal, because it would have prevented the birth of the Messiah, who was supposed to be from the Jews. Now, I think about how I would feel if I heard a law or a decree going across the nation that a certain race of people were all to be killed, how I would feel. And besides being sick to my stomach, which is probably how you would feel as well, it would be very perplexing as to why. I mean, why would this, why would we do this? And so while the king and Haman sat down and drank together, like, the king, he liked to drink, but the people in his empire were perplexed over what was happening here, and they just didn't understand it. And I guess they were no different than you and I when it comes to things like that, not totally understanding what's going on and why these things happen. So what I wanted to share with you then, as we finish with chapter 3, is some of the conclusions that we can make after reading this chapter, because again, it's more than just a story. It's something that we can learn from. The first thing that comes to mind is when it comes to Satan and the methods that he uses against us as God's children, there's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. He just keeps trying the same things. Why does he keep trying the same things? Well, maybe it's because he thinks they work. Maybe it's because he doesn't have any other tricks up his sleeve. I couldn't give you the answer to that. But when it comes to Satan and attacking God's people, that's nothing new. Okay? Also, number 2 is there's always a spiritual battle going on in this world. There's always, something going on that Satan is doing to try to thwart God's purpose. And you would think by now he would know that he can't thwart God's purpose, but he's still trying. And there's nothing new there either. The third point is, knowing this should encourage us to pray more and to pray more effectively, to really have that intimate time with God, to pray for ourselves, to pray for our brothers and sisters, to pray for those that are a part of this world that we would love if they would be our brothers and sisters, because we want the whole world to be God's children. So we want to be praying regularly for them. And number 4 is, these are the kind of challenges that we face because we live in an unbelieving world. Mordecai and Esther chose to stay behind rather than taking the journey back to Jerusalem, 400, even though it was like 400 miles of walking. They had made the decision to stay behind. And so now they were living in a world of non-Jews. So that's similar to us living in an unbelieving world. And it's always a challenge. There's always going to be challenging things that are happening that we have to rely on God to guide us and direct us. Also, when we look at Haman's hatred, as well as Mordecai's co-workers pressuring him to try to do what he deemed as wrong, that was giving that honor, bowing, kneeling down to Haman, we need to understand there's always going to be someone who resents our commitment to God, who resents our lifestyle. And there's always going to be people who are adversaries to us for that. It's about Satan trying to usurp God and God's purposes. Again, how do we counteract that? Prayer, prayer, prayer to gain our strength. Okay? So I hope you enjoyed this week's lesson on Esther chapter 3. And next week, we will go a little further into Esther and we'll dive into chapter 4. And I look forward to visiting with you then. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful weekend. And please share this video with others and subscribe to our channel. Click that little thumbs up like button. And if you would love to leave a positive comment, if there was anything that really stood out to you today in our video. Bye-bye. See you next week.